What made certain German military commanders stand out among their peers during World War II? How did these men shape the course of history through their tactical brilliance and strategic vision? In this video, we will explore the 5 greatest German generals of World War II, examining their remarkable achievements, their controversial decisions, and the legacies they left behind. These were men who revolutionized modern warfare, who led massive armies across continents, and who faced impossible choices as their nation's fortunes changed. Their stories reveal not just military genius, but also the complex relationship between duty, ambition, and morality in the midst of total war. The generals we will discuss today were not simply following orders. They were innovators who transformed military doctrine, tacticians who outwitted numerically superior enemies, and leaders who inspired fierce loyalty among their troops. Yet they also served a regime responsible for unimaginable atrocities, and their brilliance on the battlefield cannot be separated from the dark shadow of the Nazi state they fought for. How do we evaluate military excellence when it exists within such a morally compromised context? This question haunts the legacy of every commander we will examine today. Understanding these generals requires us to look beyond simple judgments of good and evil. We must examine their backgrounds, their motivations, their tactical innovations, and the specific circumstances that allowed their talents to flourish. Some came from aristocratic military families, while others rose from middle-class origins. Some questioned Hitler's strategic decisions, while others remained fanatically loyal until the end. What united them was an undeniable mastery of the art of war, demonstrated through victories that shocked the world and defeats they fought desperately to avoid. Our 5th general on this list represents a fascinating study in loyalty and tactical expertise, under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Walter Model was born on January 24, 1891, in Genthin, Germany, into a middle-class family with no aristocratic military tradition. His father was a music teacher, and young Walter's path to military greatness was not predetermined by birth. He joined the Imperial German Army in 1909 as an officer cadet and served with distinction during the First World War, earning the Iron Cross First Class for his courage under fire. The lessons he learned in the trenches of the Great War would shape his approach to command for the rest of his life. What set Model apart from many of his contemporaries was his early and enthusiastic embrace of Nazi ideology. Unlike the Prussian aristocrats who dominated the German officer corps and often viewed the Nazis with suspicion or disdain, Model joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party as early as 1925. When Hitler's movement was still struggling to gain national prominence, this political commitment would prove crucial to his career advancement, as Hitler increasingly favored ideologically reliable commanders over those with aristocratic pedigrees, but questionable loyalty to the Nazi cause. Model's military career accelerated rapidly in the years leading up to World War II. In 1938, at the age of 47, he was promoted to the rank of Major General and given command of the 4th Army Corps. This appointment came at a critical moment in German history, as Hitler prepared to unleash his war of conquest across Europe. Model's corps participated in the September 1939 invasion of Poland, where German forces demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of their new blitzkrieg tactics. The campaign lasted just over a month, with Polish resistance collapsing under the coordinated assault of German armor, infantry, and air power. For Model, it was an education in modern mobile warfare that would inform all his future operations. However, it was on the Eastern Front that Model truly made his mark. In 1941, following the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the massive German invasion of the Soviet Union, Model was appointed General of the 9th Army. The Eastern Front was unlike anything the German military had experienced before. The vast distances, the extreme weather conditions, the fanatical Soviet resistance, and the sheer numerical superiority of the Red Army created challenges that tested even the most capable commanders. Model proved himself repeatedly in this brutal theatre of war, earning a reputation for tactical ingenuity and an almost supernatural ability to stabilize collapsing front lines. One of Model's most significant contributions came during the planning stages of the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943. This was to be Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front, an attempt to regain the initiative after the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad. The German plan called for a massive pincer movement to encircle and destroy Soviet forces in a salient bulging into German lines near the city of Kursk. Model's tactical expertise proved invaluable during the planning process, as he carefully analyzed Soviet defensive preparations and warned his superiors about the formidable obstacles German forces would face. Model's concerns were well-founded. The Soviets, having broken German codes and learned of the planned offensive through intelligence networks, prepared the most elaborate defensive system ever constructed. They built multiple lines of trenches, anti-tank ditches and minefields stretching back dozens of kilometers. They concentrated enormous reserves of armor and artillery in the threatened sector. When the German assault finally began on July 5, 1943, it crashed against these defenses like a wave against a breakwater. Despite initial gains and horrific casualties on both sides, the German offensive ground to a halt within days. The Battle of Kursk marked a decisive turning point on the Eastern Front. Never again would German forces launch a major strategic offensive in the East. It was during this period that Model earned his famous nickname as Hitler's fireman. Whenever a crisis erupted on the Eastern Front, whenever a Soviet breakthrough threatened to shatter German lines, Model was the commander Hitler turned to. He had an uncanny ability to arrive at the most threatened sectors, rapidly assess the situation, and implement aggressive defensive tactics that stabilized the front. Unlike some generals who relied on rigid adherence to doctrine, Model was flexible and pragmatic, willing to adapt his methods to the specific circumstances he faced. He understood that, on the Eastern Front, with resources increasingly scarce and the enemy growing stronger, conventional approaches often meant disaster. By this point in the war, Adolf Hitler had begun to lose faith in the older generation of German generals. Many came from aristocratic Prussian families, the traditional source of Germany's military elite. Hitler, always suspicious of the aristocracy and keenly aware of their lukewarm commitment to Nazi ideology, increasingly favoured commanders from more modest backgrounds who demonstrated unwavering loyalty to the regime. Model, with his middle-class origins and early party membership, fit this profile perfectly. He was not burdened by aristocratic pretensions or old-fashioned notions of military honour that might conflict with Nazi objectives. He was, in Hitler's eyes, a thoroughly modern German general. The Führer's confidence in Model was demonstrated dramatically on March 1, 1944, when he promoted Model to the rank of Field Marshal. This was one of the highest honours in the German military, a rank traditionally reserved for commanders who had achieved truly exceptional victories. At 53 years old, Model joined an exclusive club of officers entrusted with the highest levels of command authority. The promotion came with both privilege and immense responsibility. As Field Marshal, Model would be expected to work miracles with increasingly limited resources as Germany's strategic position deteriorated. That summer brought a new crisis that would test Model's abilities to their limit. Following the successful Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, German forces in France faced mounting pressure. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding German forces in the West, came under suspicion of involvement in the July 20, 1944, assassination attempt against Hitler. The plot, organized by a group of German officers who believed Hitler was leading Germany to destruction, came shockingly close to success. A bomb exploded during a military conference, but Hitler survived with relatively minor injuries. The aftermath saw a brutal purge of suspected conspirators throughout the German military and government. Kluge was relieved of his command and summoned back to Berlin. But he never arrived. On August 19, 1944, he committed suicide, leaving behind a letter acknowledging Germany's inevitable defeat and urging Hitler to end the war. Model was immediately appointed as Kluge's replacement, becoming Commander-in-Chief of the Western Front. He arrived to find a desperate situation. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. The vaunted German Wehrmacht, which had conquered most of Europe just 4 years earlier, was now in headlong retreat. Model worked frantically to establish new defensive lines, but the Allied advance was relentless. American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces liberated Paris on August 25, 1944. Belgian cities fell in rapid succession. By early September, Allied forces had reached the German border itself. The great German Empire in the West, built on blitzkrieg victories in 1940, had collapsed in just 3 months. Model's task was no longer to win the war in France, but simply to delay the Allied advance long enough for Germany to organize defenses along its own borders. In September 1944, Model's command expanded to include Army Group B, the primary German force defending the Netherlands and the northern approach to Germany. It was here that Model achieved one of his most remarkable defensive victories. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had conceived an audacious plan called Operation Market Garden. The operation called for Allied airborne forces to seize a series of bridges across the rivers of the Netherlands, creating a corridor through which armoured forces could advance into northern Germany. If successful, the operation might end the war by Christmas 1944. Model's headquarters was located in the Dutch city of Arnhem, coincidentally one of the primary targets of Operation Market Garden. On September 17, 1944, when British and Polish paratroopers began landing near Arnhem, Model narrowly escaped capture. However, he quickly grasped the Allied plan and moved decisively to counter it. German forces, including 2 SS Panzer, divisions that happened to be refitting in the area, mounted a ferocious defence. The British paratroopers, lightly armed and cut off from reinforcement, fought desperately for control of the Arnhem Bridge. After 9 days of brutal combat, the British withdrew, leaving behind thousands of dead and captured. Operation Market Garden had failed, and Model's quick thinking had played a crucial role in that failure. The winter of 1944 brought Model's final major engagement as a field commander. In December, Hitler ordered a massive counteroffensive in the Ardennes Forest, the same region through which German armour had poured during the stunning victory over France in 1940. Hitler believed that a bold strike could split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. Model and other German commanders harboured deep doubts about the plan. They knew Germany no longer had the resources for such an ambitious operation. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Fuel supplies were critically short. The troops, though still capable of fierce resistance, were exhausted after months of constant retreat. Nevertheless, orders were orders, and Model prepared Army Group B for what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The offensive began on December 16, 1944, achieving complete surprise. German forces crashed through thinly held American lines, creating a dangerous bulge in the Allied front. For a few days, it seemed Hitler's gamble might succeed, but the initial shock wore off quickly. American forces at the town of Bastogne held out despite being surrounded. Allied air power, grounded during the initial days by bad weather, returned to devastate German supply columns. Eisenhower shifted reinforcements to contain the German penetration. By early January 1945, the offensive had clearly failed and German forces were retreating once again. The Battle of the Bulge exhausted Germany's last strategic reserves in the West. When the Allies resumed their advance in the spring of 1945, German resistance crumbled rapidly. Model's Army Group B found itself pushed back into the Ruhr region, Germany's industrial heartland. The Ruhr had once been the arsenal of the Wehrmacht, producing the tanks, guns and ammunition that had equipped Germany's conquering armies. Now it became a trap. Allied forces encircled the region, cutting off Model's forces from the rest of the German military. Inside what became known as the Ruhr Pocket, Model commanded approximately 300,000 German soldiers. They were surrounded, cut off from supplies with no hope of relief or escape. Hitler's orders were clear. Fight to the last man. Make the enemy pay for every metre of ground. But Model recognized the futility of further resistance. These soldiers, if they continued fighting, would die for no strategic purpose. Germany had already lost the war. The Red Army was in Berlin, American and Soviet. Forces were about to meet in central Germany. Further bloodshed would achieve nothing except more senseless death. On April 21, 1945, Model made his final command decision. He ordered Army Group B to surrender. It was an act of defiance against Hitler, a recognition that duty to his soldiers outweighed blind obedience to a leader who had led Germany to catastrophe. The surrender of the Ruhr Pocket was one of the largest capitulations in military history, removing over 250,000 German soldiers from the war in a single stroke. But Model himself would not live to see the peace. Haunted by the prospect of captivity, of standing trial for war crimes, of facing judgment for his service to the Nazi regime, he chose a different path. On that same day, April 24, 1945, Walter Model walked into a forest near Duisburg, drew his pistol and ended his own life. His body was not discovered until 1947. He was 54 years old, a field marshal who had never lost his loyalty to the cause. He had embraced in 1925, even as that cause led him and his nation to ruin. Walter Model's story reveals the complex relationship between tactical brilliance and ideological commitment. Unlike some German generals who distanced themselves from Nazi politics, Model was a true believer who saw no contradiction between his professional competence and his political allegiance. His nickname as Hitler's fireman was well earned through countless defensive battles, where his tactical skill delayed, if never defeated, the inevitable Allied victory. Yet that same loyalty that made him valuable to Hitler also bound him irrevocably to the regime's crimes and failures. How should history remember Walter Model? He was undeniably talented, capable of achieving remarkable results with limited resources under desperate circumstances. His defense of Arnhem prevented what might have been an earlier Allied victory. His management of multiple crisis situations on the Eastern Front probably prolonged the war by months. Yet this prolongation of the war came at a horrific cost, allowing the Nazi regime additional time to continue its genocidal policies and resulting in hundreds of thousands of additional combat deaths. Military skill divorced from moral purpose can become a terrible thing, and Model's career exemplifies this troubling truth. Our fourth general presents a very different profile, one of a traditional Prussian officer whose relationship with the Nazi regime was far more ambiguous and ultimately tragic. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge represented the old German military aristocracy, the officer class that had dominated Prussian and German armies for generations. Born on October 30th, 1882 in Posen, Germany, into a family with a long military tradition, von Kluge joined the Imperial German Army in 1901 and served throughout the First World War, rising to command positions through demonstrated competence and courage. Von Kluge's career flourished during the interwar period and into the early years of World War II. In 1939, he was appointed commander of the 4th Army of the Wehrmacht, one of the powerful formations that would spearhead Germany's conquests. During the invasion of Poland in September 1939, von Kluge's 4th Army achieved spectacular success, demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of German blitzkrieg tactics against a brave but outmatched opponent. The Polish campaign lasted just over a month, with Polish forces overwhelmed by the speed and coordination of the German assault. Von Kluge's success in Poland earned him promotion to the prestigious rank of General Feldmarschall, or Field Marshal, on July 19, 1940. This promotion came in the aftermath of Germany's even more stunning victory over France, a campaign in which von Kluge's 4th Army again distinguished itself. The Battle of France, which began on May 10, 1940, and ended with French surrender on June 22nd, astonished the world. France, considered to possess one of Europe's finest armies, collapsed in just 6 weeks. The speed of the German victory seemed to validate everything the Wehrmacht strategists had claimed about modern mobile warfare. But it was on the Eastern Front that von Kluge would face his greatest challenges and experience his most significant victories and defeats. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, on June 22, 1941, von Kluge's 4th Army formed part of Army Group Center, the formation tasked with driving directly toward Moscow. The initial weeks of the campaign seemed to promise another quick German victory. Soviet forces, caught unprepared despite numerous intelligence warnings, suffered catastrophic losses. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in massive encirclement battles. Von Kluge's forces advanced hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory, destroying Soviet armies and racing toward their ultimate objective. By October 1941, German forces stood at the gates of Moscow itself. The Soviet capital seemed within reach, but the Germans had underestimated their enemy and overestimated their own capabilities. The vast distances of Russia, the deteriorating roads, the approach of winter, and the stubborn Soviet resistance all combined to slow the German advance to a crawl. Then came the Soviet counteroffensive of December 1941, one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in military history. Soviet forces, reinforced by fresh divisions from Siberia and commanded by General Georgy Zhukov, launched massive attacks all along the front near Moscow. German forces, exhausted by months of continuous combat, short of winter equipment, and with their supply lines stretched to the breaking point, reeled backward. The myth of German invincibility, so carefully cultivated through 2 years of unbroken victories, shattered in the snow outside Moscow. It was during this crisis that Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, was relieved of command. Hitler blamed him for the failure to capture Moscow and for the subsequent retreat. On December 19, 1941, Günther von Kluge was appointed as von Bock's replacement, inheriting command of an army group that was reeling from Soviet attacks and struggling to survive the brutal Russian winter. The appointment came at one of the most critical moments of the entire war. If Army Group Center collapsed completely, the entire German position in Russia might become untenable. Von Kluge faced an almost impossible situation. His forces were spread along a vast front, with dangerous Soviet penetrations threatening to cut off entire German armies. Supply shortages meant his soldiers were fighting without adequate winter clothing, proper food, or sufficient ammunition. Temperatures plunged to -40°C. Thousands of German soldiers suffered frostbite, and equipment froze solid. Vehicles wouldn't start, weapons jammed, yet somehow through a combination of desperate defensive fighting and Hitler's infamous Stand Fast order forbidding any major retreats, Army Group Center held together. The next 2 years saw von Kluge commanding Army Group Center through some of the most brutal fighting of the war. The Eastern Front became a grinding attritional struggle, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory. German forces launched offensives during the summer months when conditions favored mobile operations, while Soviet forces struck back during winter when German mobility was reduced. The casualties on both sides were staggering, measured in the millions. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. The occupied territories of the Soviet Union became zones of unimaginable horror, where Nazi racial policies resulted in mass murder and systematic starvation. Von Kluge's command of Army Group Center ended abruptly on October 28, 1943, when he was involved in a serious automobile accident on the Eastern Front. The accident left him with severe injuries that required months of recovery. During his convalescence, von Kluge had time to reflect on Germany's deteriorating strategic situation. By late 1943, it was becoming increasingly clear to many senior German officers that the war could not be won. The failure of the Kursk offensive had demonstrated that Germany no longer had the strength to defeat the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the Western Allies were building up massive forces in Britain for an eventual invasion of France. As von Kluge recovered from his injuries, the military situation continued to worsen. The Red Army launched a series of massive offensives that drove German forces out of Ukraine and threatened to collapse the entire southern portion of the Eastern Front. In Italy, where Germany had rushed reinforcements after the Italian government's surrender, Allied forces were slowly but steadily advancing northward. The Allied strategic bombing campaign was systematically destroying Germany's industrial base and urban centers, killing tens of thousands of civilians and disrupting war production. In July 1944, as von Kluge regained his health, he received new orders. He was to proceed immediately to France to take command of all German forces in the Western occupied territories. His predecessor, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, had been dismissed after displaying what Hitler considered a defeatist attitude. Von Rundstedt had made the mistake of speaking honestly about Germany's military situation, suggesting that the war in the West was already lost following the successful Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. Hitler, who refused to accept any assessment that contradicted his belief in ultimate German victory, removed von Rundstedt and appointed von Kluge to replace him. Von Kluge arrived in France to find a catastrophic situation. The Allied invasion had established a secure beachhead in Normandy, and German attempts to drive the invaders back into the sea had failed completely. Worse still, the Allies had achieved overwhelming air superiority, making daytime movement virtually impossible for German forces. Allied fighter bombers prowled the roads of France, destroying any German vehicle they spotted. German reinforcements trying to reach the battlefield were forced to move at night and hide during daylight hours, while Allied reinforcements flowed ashore with minimal interference. Von Kluge attempted to organize a coordinated defense, but Hitler's interference made effective command nearly impossible. The Führer insisted on controlling tactical details from his headquarters in East Prussia, hundreds of kilometers from the battlefield. He forbade retreats even when they made obvious tactical sense. He demanded counterattacks that German forces lacked the strength to execute. Von Kluge found himself trapped between his professional judgment, which told him that holding Normandy was impossible, and his orders from Hitler, which demanded that every metre of ground be held regardless of cost. The situation deteriorated rapidly throughout July and early August 1944. American forces broke out of the Normandy beachhead at the end of July, achieving the kind of mobile warfare at which they excelled. German forces, battered by weeks of attritional combat and constantly harassed by Allied air power, began to collapse. Von Kluge recognized that German forces in Normandy faced encirclement and potential destruction if they didn't retreat immediately. He pleaded with Hitler for permission to withdraw to more defensible positions. Hitler refused, instead ordering yet another counterattack that had no hope of success. But von Kluge's problems extended beyond purely military concerns. Unknown to him, elements within the German officer corps had been planning to assassinate Hitler and negotiate an end to the war. On July 20th, 1944, a bomb planted by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg exploded during a military conference at Hitler's East Prussian headquarters. The blast killed 4 people and wounded others, but Hitler himself survived with relatively minor injuries. In the immediate aftermath, Hitler and his inner circle were uncertain about the extent of the conspiracy. Who else had been involved? How deep did the plot go? The Gestapo's investigation cast suspicion on numerous senior officers, including von Kluge. While von Kluge had not been directly involved in the assassination attempt, he had been in contact with some of the conspirators. Some historians believe he may have been aware of the plot and perhaps even sympathetic to it, though the evidence remains inconclusive. What is certain is that Hitler began to doubt von Kluge's loyalty. In the paranoid atmosphere following the assassination attempt, such doubts could be fatal. On August 15, 1944, von Kluge made a decision that sealed his fate. He drove to the front lines to personally assess the tactical situation and coordinate the retreat of German forces from an encirclement forming near the town of Falaise. During this trip, his radio vehicle was destroyed by Allied aircraft, cutting off his communications with headquarters for several crucial hours. When Hitler learned that von Kluge was out of contact, his suspicions exploded into certainty. He became convinced that von Kluge was attempting to negotiate a separate surrender with the Allies, perhaps even trying to defect to the enemy side. In reality, von Kluge was simply trying to salvage what he could from the military disaster unfolding in Normandy. By the time he re-established contact with headquarters, the damage was done. On August 17, 1944, Hitler ordered von Kluge to return immediately to Germany. The Field Marshal understood exactly what this summons meant. He had seen what happened to officers suspected of disloyalty. The People's Court that tried the July 20th conspirators had already condemned dozens of officers to death by hanging, their trials filmed for propaganda purposes. Von Kluge began the journey back to Germany, but he never arrived. On August 19, 1844, near the city of Metz in eastern France, he ordered his driver to stop. He took a cyanide capsule and ended his own life. He was 61 years old. In his final letter to Hitler, von Kluge acknowledged that Germany had lost the war and urged the Führer to make peace, while some semblance of Germany still existed, to negotiate. The letter, of course, had no effect. Hitler dismissed it as the ravings of a defeatist and continued to demand that German forces fight to the last man. Günther von Kluge's tragedy lies in the fundamental contradiction he embodied. He was a product of the old Prussian military tradition, with its emphasis on duty, honor, and professional competence. Yet he served a regime that perverted those values, that used the German military's effectiveness to pursue policies of conquest and genocide. Von Kluge was not a Nazi true believer-like model, but neither was he willing to actively resist Hitler until it was far too late. His final letter, written with death already certain, revealed a man who had finally recognized the moral catastrophe he had served, but who lacked the courage or the opportunity to act on that recognition while it might have mattered. The relationship between traditional German military elites and the Nazi regime was always fraught with tension. Officers like von Kluge had been raised in a culture that valued loyalty to the state and obedience to legitimate authority. When Hitler came to power through constitutional means in 1933, he became that legitimate authority. The oath that German officers swore was not to Germany or to the Constitution, but to Hitler personally. This oath created a psychological bind that many officers found impossible to break, even as they watched Hitler lead Germany toward catastrophe. What makes von Kluge's story particularly poignant is the timing of his death. He died just as the war was entering its final, most desperate phase. Within 9 months, Nazi Germany would cease to exist. The regime he had served would be utterly destroyed. Hitler would commit suicide in his Berlin bunker, and the full horror of the Holocaust would be revealed to the world. Had von Kluge lived just a little longer, he might have witnessed the end he foresaw in his final letter. Instead, he chose death over the humiliation of surrender and the possibility of standing trial for his role in Germany's wars of aggression. Our third general on this list is perhaps the most famous German military commander of World War II, a man whose name became synonymous with tactical brilliance and whose reputation transcended national boundaries to earn respect even from his enemies. Erwin Johannes Eugen Rommel was born on November 15, 1891, in Heidenheim, a small town in southern Germany. Unlike the aristocratic Prussian officers who dominated the German military establishment, Rommel came from a middle-class background. His father was a schoolteacher, and young Erwin initially showed more interest in engineering than military service. However, he eventually chose a military career, joining the Imperial German Army as an officer cadet in 1910. Rommel's experiences during World War I shaped his entire approach to military command. He served in France, Romania, and Italy, earning a reputation for audacious tactical decisions and personal bravery. It was during the Battle of Caporetto in Italy in October 1917 that Rommel truly distinguished himself. Leading his mountain infantry company in an assault against Italian positions, he demonstrated the qualities that would later make him famous: aggressive initiative, rapid decision-making, and a willingness to take risks that more cautious commanders would avoid. For his exceptional performance at Caporetto, Rommel received the Pour le Mérite, Imperial Germany's highest military decoration. He was just 26 years old. The interwar years saw Rommel serving in various training and instructional roles. He wrote a book based on his World War I experiences, titled Infantry Attacks, published in 1937. The book was more than just a memoir. It was a detailed tactical manual that examined specific combat situations and analyzed the decisions that led to success or failure. The book caught the attention of Adolf Hitler, who read it with great interest. Hitler, always attracted to bold and aggressive commanders who shared his own preference for decisive action over cautious planning, marked Rommel as an officer to watch. When World War II began in September 1939, Rommel was assigned to command the security detachment responsible for guarding Hitler's headquarters during the Polish campaign. This assignment might seem mundane, but it gave Rommel something invaluable: direct access to the Führer himself. While other generals communicated with Hitler through formal chains of command, Rommel spent weeks in close proximity to the leader of Nazi Germany. He observed Hitler's working methods, learned his preferences, and established a personal relationship that would dramatically affect his future career. Rommel desperately wanted a combat command. He was a field soldier at heart, not a staff officer, and he chafed at being kept away from the action. Hitler, impressed by Rommel's energy and his aggressive tactical philosophy, granted that wish. In February 1940, Rommel was given command of the 7th Panzer Division, one of the armoured formations that would spearhead Germany's invasion of France. For Rommel, who had spent most of his career commanding infantry, this was an unexpected assignment. He had limited experience with armoured warfare, the new military doctrine that German theorists claimed would revolutionize modern combat. But Rommel was a quick study, and he grasped the essential principles of tank warfare with remarkable speed. The German invasion of France began on May 10, 1940, and Rommel's 7th Panzer Division quickly made its mark. While other panzer divisions advanced methodically according to plan, Rommel drove his forces forward with reckless aggression. He led from the front, often positioning himself at the head of his advancing columns, personally directing attacks and overcoming obstacles through sheer will and tactical improvisation. His division moved so quickly that it earned the nickname Gespenster Division, the Ghost Division, because German high command sometimes lost track of its location. Rommel's tactics during the French campaign established patterns that would define his career. He believed in maintaining constant pressure on the enemy, never allowing them time to recover or organize coherent defenses. When his forces encountered resistance, he didn't bog down in methodical attacks, but instead sought to bypass strong points and strike at vulnerable rear areas. He understood that in modern mobile warfare, psychological impact mattered as much as physical destruction. An enemy who believed he was surrounded and cut off might surrender even if he still had the strength to fight. The French campaign ended in total German victory after just 6 weeks. France, which had fought Germany to a standstill during 4 years of World War I, collapsed with stunning rapidity. Rommel's 7th Panzer Division had advanced farther and faster than any other German unit, capturing tens of thousands of French prisoners and demonstrating the devastating potential of aggressive armor tactics. Rommel had proven himself not just as an infantry leader, but as one of Germany's most capable armoured commanders. In February 1941, Rommel received the assignment that would make him a legend. Germany's Italian allies in North Africa were in desperate trouble. British and Commonwealth forces had driven the Italian army out of eastern Libya and were threatening to expel Axis forces from North Africa entirely. Hitler, concerned about the strategic implications of losing North Africa, decided to send German reinforcements. He needed a commander who could stabilize the situation with limited resources, someone who could adapt to unfamiliar conditions and make the most of whatever forces he had available. Rommel seemed the perfect choice. Rommel arrived in Tripoli, Libya, on February 12, 1941, to take command of what would become known as the Africa Corps. His forces initially consisted of just 2 divisions, laughably small compared to the vast armies fighting on the Eastern Front. The Italian forces he was meant to work with were demoralized and poorly equipped. The North African theatre presented unique challenges: vast distances, extreme heat, limited water supplies and supply lines that stretched across the Mediterranean Sea, where British naval and air power took a heavy toll on Axis shipping. Despite these obstacles, or perhaps because of them, Rommel thrived. The North African desert suited his aggressive, tactical style perfectly. The lack of civilians and infrastructure meant armies could maneuver freely across the landscape, making mobility and tactical skill more important than simple numerical superiority. Within weeks of his arrival, Rommel launched an offensive that caught the British completely by surprise. His forces drove the British back across Libya, recaptured all the territory Italy had lost, and laid siege to the vital port of Tobruk. For the next 18 months, the North African campaign became a seesaw struggle, with both sides alternately advancing and retreating across the desert. Rommel became famous not just in Germany but internationally. British newspapers dubbed him the Desert Fox, a nickname that captured both his tactical cunning and the grudging respect his enemies felt for his abilities. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill spoke admiringly of Rommel in the House of Commons, calling him a great general. This was extraordinary, as Churchill rarely praised enemy commanders so openly. What made Rommel so effective in North Africa? Several factors contributed to his success. First, he maintained an intense operational tempo that kept the British constantly off balance. Second, he led from the front with a personal courage that inspired fierce loyalty among his troops. Third, he had an uncanny ability to sense the right moment to strike, exploiting fleeting opportunities before they disappeared. Finally, he understood logistics, the unglamorous but critical science of keeping armies supplied in hostile environments. However, Rommel's most famous offensive came in May and June 1942, when he launched an attack against British positions at Gazala. The resulting battle showcased Rommel at his tactical best. He feinted at the British front lines, then swept around the southern flank with his armoured forces, threatening to encircle the British position. The British, forced to react, fed their armour piecemeal into a series of tank battles where Rommel's superior tactical coordination and use of anti-tank guns gave him a decisive advantage. By mid-June, British forces were in full retreat, and Rommel had finally captured Tobruk, the fortress that had resisted German attacks for nearly a year. The fall of Tobruk shocked the British public and their leaders. 33,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers surrendered, along with massive quantities of supplies that Rommel desperately needed. Hitler, ecstatic at this victory, promoted Rommel to Field Marshal on June 22, 1942. At 50 years old, Rommel became the youngest field marshal in the German army. The promotion came with a characteristic warning from Rommel himself, who noted that he would now be expected to achieve even greater things with even fewer resources. Rommel's advance continued into Egypt, bringing Axis forces within striking distance of Cairo and the Suez Canal. The situation looked desperate for the British. If Rommel could seize the Suez Canal, he would cut Britain's maritime link to India and the Far East. The entire British position in the Middle East might collapse. Churchill flew to Egypt personally to assess the crisis and shake up the command structure. He appointed new commanders, General Harold Alexander as overall commander in the Middle East, and Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery to command the 8th Army facing Rommel. Montgomery was everything Rommel was not: cautious, methodical, obsessed with careful preparation and overwhelming superiority before launching any offensive. Where Rommel relied on speed and surprise, Montgomery insisted on patient build-up of forces. Where Rommel led from the front, Montgomery stayed at his headquarters, managing the battle like a chess match. These contrasting styles would clash at El Alamein, a small town on the Egyptian coast where the desert narrows between the Mediterranean Sea and the impassable Qattara Depression. Rommel attacked first in late August 1942, trying to break through British positions before Montgomery could complete his defensive preparations. The attack failed. Rommel's forces, at the end of an impossibly long supply line and desperately short of fuel and ammunition, could not overcome British defences backed by fresh troops and plentiful supplies. It was the first time Rommel had been decisively repulsed in North Africa, and it signalled a fundamental shift in the campaign's dynamics. Montgomery's counter-offensive came on October 23, 1942. The Second Battle of El Alamein began with a massive artillery bombardment that dwarfed anything previously seen in North Africa. Montgomery had assembled overwhelming force, more than 1,000 tanks against Rommel's 500, and superiority in artillery, aircraft, and manpower. The battle lasted 12 days, with British forces grinding methodically through Axis defences. Rommel, back in Germany for health reasons when the battle began, rushed back to his command but could do nothing to change the outcome. On November 4, 1942, he ordered his forces to retreat. The defeat at El Alamein marked the end of Rommel's North African offensive operations. His forces retreated across Libya, fighting delaying actions but unable to halt the British advance. To make matters worse, American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria on November 8, 1942, as part of Operation Torch. Rommel now faced enemies on two fronts, with Axis supply lines across the Mediterranean under constant attack. The strategic situation was hopeless, yet Hitler demanded that North Africa be held at all costs. Rommel fought a brilliant series of delaying actions across Tunisia through the winter and early spring of 1943. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, he inflicted a sharp defeat on inexperienced American forces, demonstrating that even in retreat he remained a dangerous opponent. But tactical victories could not change strategic realities. The Axis forces in Tunisia were trapped in an ever-shrinking perimeter, cut off from supply, outnumbered and outgunned. In March 1943, Hitler finally authorized Rommel to leave North Africa and return to Germany. It was an escape, saving Rommel from the inevitable capture or death that awaited the Afrika Korps. The departure from Africa marked the end of Rommel's greatest period of fame. The Afrika Korps fought on without him until May 1943, when the remaining German and Italian forces in Tunisia finally surrendered. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers went into captivity, a loss comparable to the disaster at Stalingrad just 3 months earlier. The North African campaign had cost the Axis dearly in men, equipment, and prestige. Yet it had also demonstrated Rommel's exceptional abilities as a commander. He had achieved far more with limited resources than anyone had thought possible, and he had done so against opponents who enjoyed massive material advantages. Back in Germany, Rommel received a hero's welcome. The Nazi propaganda machine had built him into a larger-than-life figure, using his victories to boost morale as Germany's strategic situation deteriorated. Rommel was paraded before the German public, gave speeches, and met with Hitler multiple times. But beneath the propaganda gloss, Rommel had begun to develop serious doubts about Germany's prospects in the war and about Hitler's leadership. His experiences in North Africa had shown him the tremendous material superiority the Allies could bring to bear. He knew that Italy was on the verge of collapse, and he had heard rumors about the catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front. In November 1943, Rommel received a new assignment that would define the final phase of his military career. He was appointed commander of Army Group B in northern France and given responsibility for defending the Atlantic coast against the Allied invasion everyone knew was coming. Hitler believed that Germany's best chance lay in defeating an Allied invasion at the beaches before the attackers could establish a secure foothold. If the invasion could be thrown back into the sea, Hitler reasoned, the Western Allies might lose heart and seek a negotiated peace. This would allow Germany to concentrate all its resources against the Soviet Union. Rommel threw himself into his new mission with characteristic energy. He toured the entire Atlantic coastline from Holland to Brittany, inspecting defences and demanding improvements. What he found alarmed him. The much-vaunted Atlantic Wall that German propaganda described as impregnable was actually a series of scattered strongpoints with huge gaps between them. Many of the defences existed only on paper. Troops were often poorly trained and equipped with obsolete weapons. The quality of German forces in the West had deteriorated as Hitler stripped divisions to send reinforcements to the Eastern Front. Rommel set about transforming the coastal defences with the same innovative thinking he had displayed in North Africa. He ordered the construction of millions of mines, buried on the beaches and in the fields behind them. He had obstacles placed in likely landing zones to prevent glider and parachute landings. Where beaches offered good landing sites, he ordered underwater obstacles, topped with mines to tear open landing craft at high tide. He had concrete bunkers and gun positions constructed to cover every possible approach. The work proceeded frantically through the winter and spring of 1944, but Rommel knew they were racing against time. The fundamental strategic question facing German commanders in France was where to position the armoured reserves. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the west and Rommel's superior, believed the panzer divisions should be held well back from the coast. This would keep them safe from Allied naval gunfire and air attack, and allow them to counterattack wherever the main Allied landing occurred. Rommel, drawing on his North African experience, vehemently disagreed. He knew that Allied air superiority would make daylight movement almost impossible for German armour. Any reserves held inland would be delayed by constant air attacks while trying to reach the coast. Rommel argued for placing the panzer divisions close to the beaches, ready to counterattack immediately against any landing. His slogan was that the invasion must be defeated in the first 24 hours, or not at all. If Allied forces secured a beachhead and brought their massive material superiority ashore, German forces would face the same situation that had doomed the Afrika Korps, fighting an enemy who could replace losses while German strength steadily dwindled. The debate over armoured reserves was never fully resolved, with Hitler eventually splitting the difference in a compromise that satisfied no one and left the panzer divisions too dispersed to deliver a decisive counterattack. The Allied invasion began in the early morning hours of June 6, 1944. Rommel was not at his headquarters when it happened. He had driven to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and to meet with Hitler to plead for more resources. The irony was bitter. After months of preparation, after correctly predicting that the attack would come in Normandy, despite most German commanders expecting it at the Pas de Calais, Rommel was absent at the critical moment. By the time he raced back to his headquarters, Allied forces had already secured their initial beachheads. The next 6 weeks saw Rommel fighting a desperate defensive battle against overwhelming odds. The Allies brought ashore men and material at a rate that made German resupply efforts look pathetic. Allied naval guns pounded German positions with impunity. Allied aircraft ruled the skies, making movement by day nearly suicidal for German forces. The bocage countryside of Normandy, with its small fields bordered by thick hedgerows, favoured the defence, and German troops fought with suicidal determination. But slowly, inexorably, the Allies expanded their beachhead. Rommel could see that the situation was hopeless. Unlike some German commanders who remained in denial about Germany's prospects, Rommel faced reality. He knew Germany could not win the war in the West. He knew that continuing to fight would only prolong the agony and increase the destruction. He began to believe that Germany needed to seek an armistice with the Western Allies before the country was completely devastated. This was a dangerous thought, one that could be interpreted as defeatism or even treason. But Rommel had reached the point where his duty to Germany outweighed his loyalty to Hitler. On July 17, 1944, Rommel's staff car was travelling between headquarters when British fighter bombers spotted it. The planes dove to attack, their cannons tearing into the vehicle. The driver was killed instantly, and the car careened off the road, flipping over multiple times. Rommel suffered severe head injuries, including a fractured skull and damage to his left eye. He was rushed to a hospital in a critical condition. The injuries ended his active military service. He would never command troops in battle again. While Rommel lay recovering from his injuries, the conspiracy against Hitler came to its climax. On July 20, 1944, just 3 days after Rommel's injury, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb at Hitler's conference room in East Prussia. The explosion killed 4 people, but Hitler survived. The failed assassination attempt triggered a massive crackdown on suspected conspirators. Under torture and interrogation, several plotters mentioned Rommel's name. The exact nature of Rommel's involvement remains unclear to this day. He had been in contact with some of the conspirators. He had expressed views critical of Hitler's leadership, but whether he actively participated in the plot or simply knew about it remains a subject of historical debate. Hitler faced a dilemma regarding Rommel. On one hand, he suspected Rommel of at least knowing about the plot, possibly even supporting it. On the other hand, Rommel was Germany's most famous general, a propaganda icon whose public disgrace or execution would damage German morale. Hitler chose a characteristically cynical solution. He would give Rommel a choice: suicide or a show trial followed by execution, with his family facing persecution and disgrace. On October 14, 1944, 2 generals arrived at Rommel's home in Herrlingen. They explained Hitler's offer. If Rommel committed suicide, it would be announced that he had died from his earlier injuries. He would receive a state funeral with full military honors. His family would not be persecuted and his military pension would be preserved. If he refused, he would face trial before the People's Court, where the verdict was already determined. After the trial, he would be hanged, and his family would face the consequences. Rommel had always been a pragmatist. He understood that he had no real choice. At 52 years old, in poor health, facing overwhelming evidence of his involvement with the conspiracy, he could not escape Hitler's vengeance. But he could protect his wife and son. He could preserve his reputation for history. And perhaps in some small way, he could send a message about the corruption of the regime he had served. Rommel said goodbye to his wife and son, telling them he would be dead in 15 minutes. He left his home, entered a car with the 2 generals and drove a short distance away. There, he bit down on a cyanide capsule. The poison acted quickly. Within minutes, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was dead. His body was returned to his family with the official explanation that he had succumbed to his injuries from the earlier air attack. On October 18, 1944, Rommel received the state funeral Hitler had promised. High-ranking Nazi officials attended, giving speeches praising his service to Germany. The German public mourned the loss of their most celebrated military hero. Only years later, after the war ended and the truth emerged, did the world learn the real circumstances of Rommel's death. Rommel's legacy remains controversial and complex. In the years after World War II, he became something of a romanticized figure, especially in the West. The Rommel myth portrayed him as an apolitical professional soldier, a chivalrous warrior who fought cleanly and resisted Nazi ideology. Some of this myth was true. Rommel did not participate in war crimes. He treated prisoners according to the Geneva Conventions. He ignored Hitler's orders to execute captured commandos. He had no involvement in the Holocaust, which was largely unknown to him given his focus on military operations. However, more recent historical scholarship has painted a more nuanced picture. Rommel was not as politically naive as the myth suggests. He benefited greatly from his association with Hitler and the Nazi regime. He was aware of at least some of the regime's crimes, even if he was not directly involved in them. His legendary status was partly created by Nazi propaganda, which he willingly participated in. And while he may have questioned Hitler's strategic decisions late in the war, he served the regime loyally through years of aggressive conquest. What cannot be disputed is Rommel's exceptional talent as a military commander. His victories in France and North Africa demonstrated tactical brilliance of the highest order. He had an intuitive grasp of mobile warfare, an ability to make quick decisions under pressure, and a personal courage that inspired his troops. He understood the psychological dimensions of combat as well as the physical ones. His aggressive leadership style achieved results that more cautious commanders could never have matched. Yet talent and skill can serve evil purposes as effectively as good ones. Rommel's brilliance prolonged a war that Germany had already morally lost, even before it became militarily untenable. His victories in 1940 helped establish Nazi control over Western Europe. His North African campaigns, while ultimately unsuccessful, diverted Allied resources and delayed operations that might have shortened the war. The uncomfortable truth is that Rommel's military genius served a genocidal regime, and his legacy must be understood in that context. The three commanders we have examined so far represent different types of German military leadership during World War II. Walter Model embodied the new Nazi-aligned officer, whose middle-class background and ideological commitment made him acceptable to Hitler in ways the old Prussian aristocracy never could be. Günther von Kluge represented that old aristocracy, trapped between traditional military values and loyalty to a regime that perverted those values. Erwin Rommel was somewhere between these extremes, a talented commander who benefited from Nazi patronage but who ultimately questioned the regime's leadership even if he could not fully break from it. What unites these three is that all died by their own hand, rather than face capture or the consequences of their choices. Model chose suicide over surrender. Kluge chose suicide over facing Hitler's wrath for failing to hold France. Rommel chose suicide to protect his family from persecution. These deaths by suicide reflected the impossible moral position these men found themselves in as Germany's defeat became inevitable. They had tied their fates to a regime whose defeat meant not just military failure, but moral reckoning for unprecedented crimes. The question of how to evaluate these commanders remains difficult. Should military excellence be celebrated regardless of the cause it serves? Can we admire tactical brilliance while condemning the strategic goals that brilliance advanced? Or does service to a genocidal regime forever taint any achievements? No matter how impressive from a purely military standpoint. These are not merely academic questions. They go to the heart of how we understand the relationship between professional competence and moral responsibility. Consider the practical impact of their decisions. Every day that Model's defensive tactics delayed Allied advances was another day the Holocaust continued. Every victory Rommel achieved in North Africa meant more Allied casualties and more resources diverted from operations that might have ended the war sooner. The very excellence that made these men worthy of study also made them effective servants of one of history's most evil regimes. Their skill prolonged suffering and death on an unimaginable scale. Yet to refuse to study these commanders because of the regime they served would be its own form of historical blindness. Military professionals around the world still study Rommel's campaigns in North Africa and Model's defensive operations because they offer genuine insights into military leadership and tactics. The techniques they developed, the problems they solved, the decisions they made under pressure, all of these remain relevant to understanding modern warfare. The key is to approach this study with clear moral awareness of the context in which these men operated. The remaining two generals on our list present their own complex legacies, but with some crucial differences that make their stories particularly fascinating. Unlike the three we have already examined, these final two commanders survived the war. They faced Allied justice systems, stood trial for war crimes, and lived to see the Cold War transform the world they had fought to preserve. Their survival allowed them to shape their own narratives, to write memoirs, and to influence how history would remember them. Whether this opportunity to defend their reputations makes their legacies clearer or more complicated is something we must evaluate carefully. These final two men also share another distinction. They were not simply tactical commanders, but strategic thinkers who influenced how Germany fought the war. They developed doctrines and concepts that changed military theory. Their ideas were studied and adapted by armies around the world. In some ways, their intellectual contributions outlived the specific battles they fought and the regime they served. This raises yet another question. Can military theory be separated from the political goals it was designed to serve? When studying innovation in warfare, can we extract useful lessons while rejecting the purposes those innovations were meant to achieve? Our second general on this list was not just a battlefield commander, but a revolutionary military theorist whose ideas fundamentally changed how modern armies fight. Heinz Wilhelm Guderian was born on June 17, 1888, in Kulm, in what was then the German Empire and is now Poland. His father was a professional army officer, and young Heinz followed naturally into military service, joining a Hanoverian Jaeger battalion in 1907 as an officer cadet. He served throughout World War I, primarily in staff and communications roles rather than frontline combat. This experience with military communications and coordinations would later prove crucial to his development of armored warfare doctrine. What set Guderian apart from other German officers of his generation was his willingness to challenge conventional military thinking. After World War I, while many German officers focused on refighting the last war, Guderian looked forward. He became fascinated by the potential of tanks, which had appeared on the battlefield late in the Great War, but had been used primarily in supporting roles. Guderian envisioned something far more radical. Entire armies built around tanks, moving at high speed to punch through enemy lines and wreak havoc in rear areas before the enemy could react. This vision ran counter to established military doctrine in every major army. Tanks were seen as infantry support weapons, meant to accompany foot soldiers in methodical attacks against fortified positions. The idea that tanks could operate independently, that entire campaigns could be built around armored mobility, struck many traditional officers as dangerous fantasy. After all, tanks of the 1920s were slow, mechanically unreliable, and vulnerable to breakdown. How could such machines form the backbone of a modern army? Guderian spent years developing and refining his theories. He studied the writings of British military theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart, who had also recognized the revolutionary potential of armored warfare. He conducted practical experiments with the limited armored vehicles available to the German army, which was severely restricted by the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. He worked on developing tactics for coordinating tanks with motorized infantry, artillery, and aircraft. Slowly, he built a comprehensive doctrine for what would become known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. In 1937, Guderian published his most influential work, Achtung, Panzer. The book was part technical manual, part strategic argument, and part prophetic vision. Guderian laid out in detail how mechanized forces could achieve strategic objectives through speed and shock, rather than through the grinding attrition that had characterized World War I. He argued that future wars would be won by mobile forces that could paralyze enemy command structures, disrupt supply lines, and create psychological panic before defenders could organize coherent resistance. The book caught the attention of Adolf Hitler, who was always attracted to bold new ideas that promised quick victories. Unlike conservative Wehrmacht officers who viewed Guderian's theories with skepticism, Hitler saw them as a way to overcome Germany's strategic vulnerabilities. Germany could not win a long war of attrition against countries with greater populations and resources. But a short war, won through superior tactics and speed, might allow Germany to defeat its enemies one by one, before they could coordinate their defense. Guderian's theories fit perfectly with Hitler's strategic needs. In 1938, Guderian was promoted to command Germany's mobile forces, the units that would put his theories into practice. This appointment was controversial within the German military establishment. Many senior officers remained unconvinced that armored warfare could deliver on its promises. They worried that concentrating so many resources on tanks meant neglecting traditional infantry and artillery. They feared that an army built around armored mobility would be vulnerable if those tanks broke down or were destroyed. Guderian faced resistance not just from conservative thinking, but from genuine concerns about practicality. The test of Guderian's theories came in September 1939 with the invasion of Poland. Guderian commanded the 19th Army Corps, a primarily armored formation that spearheaded the attack from Germany into Poland. The campaign vindicated Guderian's vision spectacularly. His forces advanced with unprecedented speed, bypassing Polish strongpoints, driving deep into Polish territory and creating chaos in the Polish rear areas. Polish forces, trying to defend along traditional lines, found themselves constantly outflanked and surrounded. Within days, Polish military organization collapsed. Within weeks, Poland ceased to exist as an independent state. The Polish campaign demonstrated several key principles of Guderian's doctrine. First, speed and momentum were more valuable than methodical advance. Second, armoured forces could operate independently for days at a time, maintaining their advance through surprise and aggression rather than waiting for infantry to catch up. Third, the psychological impact of rapid armoured penetration was as important as the physical destruction those forces caused. Polish defenders who learned that German tanks were in their rear areas often fled or surrendered, even when they had the strength to fight. However, the true test of blitzkrieg came in May 1940 with the invasion of France. France possessed what many experts considered the world's finest army. French forces were well-equipped, well-trained, and supported by British forces. The French had spent enormous resources building the Maginot Line, an elaborate system of fortifications along the German border. French military doctrine emphasized methodical defense and powerful counterattacks. On paper, France should have been able to stop any German attack and perhaps defeat Germany in a long war of attrition. Guderian's forces destroyed those expectations in just 6 weeks. The German plan called for a massive armoured thrust through the Ardennes forest, terrain that French commanders had dismissed as impassable for tanks. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps led this thrust, navigating narrow forest roads and emerging on May 13, 1940, at Sedan, on the Meuse River. French defences at Sedan were relatively light, as commanders had not expected a major attack through the Ardennes. Within hours, Guderian's forces had crossed the Meuse and broken through French defensive lines. What followed was one of the most remarkable military campaigns in history. Guderian's armoured forces raced westward toward the English Channel, advancing up to 60 kilometres per day. French and British forces tried desperately to respond, but Guderian stayed ahead of their counter-moves. He violated his own orders, advancing faster than German high command wanted, but his aggression kept the Allies off balance. By May 21st, his forces had reached the Channel coast, cutting Allied armies in half. French forces to the south were separated from British forces, and French units to the north. The campaign's decisive phase had taken just 8 days. French and British commanders were stunned. Their carefully planned defences had been rendered irrelevant by Guderian's speed. Forces that might have stopped a methodical German advance had no time to concentrate, before Guderian's panzers were already behind them. The Allies attempted counterattacks, but their forces were too dispersed and too slow to catch Guderian's mobile columns. Within weeks, France sued for peace, and British forces evacuated from Dunkirk. The defeat of France, which had resisted Germany for 4 years in World War I, took just 6 weeks in 1940. Guderian's success in France made him famous and seemed to vindicate his theories completely. The campaign became the textbook example of blitzkrieg warfare, studied by military officers around the world. German propaganda celebrated the victory as proof of German military superiority, though the reality was more complex. Guderian's success depended not just on German skill, but on Allied mistakes, on favourable terrain, and on the element of surprise. The French campaign worked because conditions were nearly perfect for Guderian's approach. The question was whether those conditions could be replicated elsewhere. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 would test whether blitzkrieg could succeed against a truly massive enemy with vast territory to trade for time. Guderian commanded the 2nd Panzer Group as part of Army Group Center, the formation tasked with driving toward Moscow. The initial weeks of Operation Barbarossa seemed to promise another quick victory. Soviet forces, caught unprepared despite numerous warnings, suffered catastrophic losses. Guderian's panzers advanced hundreds of kilometers, encircling enormous Soviet armies and racing deeper into Soviet territory. By October 1941, Guderian's forces were within striking distance of Moscow. The Soviet capital seemed within reach, but the conditions that had made blitzkrieg successful in France did not exist in Russia. The distances were vastly greater, straining German supply lines to their breaking point. The roads deteriorated into mud with the autumn rains, slowing even tracked vehicles. Soviet resistance, while initially chaotic, was becoming more organized and more fanatical. And winter was coming, the Russian winter that had destroyed Napoleon's army more than a century earlier. Guderian pushed his forces forward, trying to maintain the momentum that had worked so well in earlier campaigns. But momentum alone could not overcome the fundamental problems facing the German army. His tanks were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. Fuel supplies were critically short. Winter equipment had not arrived because German planners had expected the campaign to be over before winter began. When the Soviet counteroffensive came in December 1941, German forces were exhausted, overstretched, and dangerously vulnerable. Hitler's response to the crisis was to order all German forces to stand fast, forbidding any retreat regardless of tactical circumstances. Guderian, who had always advocated flexible tactics that emphasized mobility and maneuver, found this order strategically absurd. He argued forcefully for tactical retreats to more defensible positions, for pulling back forces that were in danger of being cut off. Hitler refused, and the conflict between the Führer's rigid orders and Guderian's tactical judgment came to a head. Making matters worse, Guderian found himself in conflict with his immediate superior, Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had taken command of Army Group Center. The two men had very different command styles and strategic philosophies. Kluge was more willing to follow Hitler's orders without question, while Guderian insisted on the tactical flexibility that had made him successful. The tensions between them escalated throughout December 1941 as the Soviet counteroffensive intensified and German forces reeled backward despite Hitler's stand-fast order. On December 25, 1941, Christmas Day, Guderian was relieved of his command. The official reason was his refusal to obey Hitler's orders and the conflict with von Kluge. But there were deeper issues at play. Guderian represented a certain kind of independence that Hitler was becoming less willing to tolerate as the war turned against Germany. The early victories had made Hitler believe in his own military genius, and he was less inclined to accept advice or criticism from professional soldiers. Guderian's removal was a warning to other generals. Loyalty and obedience mattered more than expertise or past success. For more than a year, Guderian remained without a command, effectively sidelined from the war. He watched from the sidelines as the war on the Eastern Front became an increasingly desperate struggle. The German summer offensive of 1942 reached Stalingrad and the Caucasus, but failed to achieve the decisive victory Hitler promised. That winter, the Sixth Army was surrounded and destroyed at Stalingrad, a catastrophe that cost Germany hundreds of thousands of soldiers and marked the beginning of the end for German hopes in the East. In March 1943, with Germany's strategic situation deteriorating and the need for expertise becoming undeniable, Hitler recalled Guderian to active service. But rather than giving him a field command, Hitler appointed him Inspector General of Armored Troops. This position gave Guderian sweeping authority over the organization, training and deployment of all German armored forces. It was a recognition of his expertise, but also a way of keeping him away from frontline command, where he might question Hitler's orders too openly. As Inspector General, Guderian worked frantically to rebuild Germany's armoured strength after the disasters of 1942 and early 1943. He pushed for increased tank production, demanding that factories prioritise quality over the elaborate over-engineering that often plagued German armoured vehicles. He insisted on better training for tank crews, pointing out that the most advanced tank in the world was useless if the crew didn't know how to use it effectively. He fought constant bureaucratic battles with other branches of the Wehrmacht and with Nazi Party officials who wanted to divert resources to their own projects. One of Guderian's key insights during this period was that Germany needed to focus on defensive operations rather than continued offensives. The initiative had passed to the Soviets, who were growing stronger every month while German strength declined. Guderian argued that Germany should husband its resources, fight from prepared positions, and force the Soviets to pay a heavy price for every kilometre they advanced. This strategy might not win the war, but it could prolong resistance long enough for political circumstances to change, or for new weapons to tip the balance. Hitler, however, still believed in the possibility of decisive offensive victory. In summer 1943, he ordered a massive attack at Kursk, intended to encircle and destroy Soviet forces in a large salient bulging into German lines. Guderian opposed the operation, arguing that German forces lacked the strength for such an ambitious undertaking and that the Soviets had clearly prepared elaborate defences. His objections were overruled. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 resulted in enormous casualties on both sides, but ended with the German offensive ground to a halt. It was Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. The failure at Kursk vindicated Guderian's warnings but did nothing to improve his relationship with Hitler. The Führer blamed others for the failure while continuing to insist that offensive operations were the only way to win the war. Guderian found himself in an impossible position. His expertise was valued enough that he retained significant authority, but his strategic advice was routinely ignored whenever it conflicted with Hitler's preferences. It was a situation that many talented German officers faced as the war turned against Germany. The July 20, 1944, assassination attempt against Hitler created another crisis and another opportunity for Guderian. The bomb that exploded at Hitler's headquarters killed several people but left the Führer relatively unharmed. In the investigation and purge that followed, hundreds of officers were arrested, tried, and executed. The German military was thrown into chaos as Hitler's paranoia reached new heights. Someone had to step into the void at the highest levels of command, someone Hitler trusted despite the general atmosphere of suspicion. On July 21, 1944, just one day after the assassination attempt, Guderian was appointed acting chief of staff of the German armed forces, one of the highest positions in the German military hierarchy. It was a remarkable promotion for someone who had been dismissed from command just 2.5 years earlier. But it also placed Guderian in an increasingly impossible situation. As Chief of Staff, he was responsible for coordinating Germany's military efforts across multiple fronts, all of which were deteriorating simultaneously. Soviet forces were driving toward Poland and the Balkans. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. Italy was collapsing. Germany's strategic position was hopeless. Guderian did what he could to manage the disasters unfolding on every front. He argued for more realistic defensive strategies, for abandoning untenable positions, for concentrating forces where they might actually achieve something. But Hitler continued to interfere in tactical decisions, issuing orders that made no military sense, forbidding retreats that were strategically necessary, and demanding counterattacks that exhausted Germany's remaining reserves to no purpose. The relationship between Guderian and Hitler became increasingly strained as the gap between military reality and Hitler's fantasies widened. By early 1945, the situation had become completely untenable. Soviet forces were advancing through Poland toward Germany itself. The Western Allies had recovered from the Battle of the Bulge and were preparing to cross the Rhine. Germany's cities were being systematically destroyed by round-the-clock bombing. Resources were exhausted, the transportation system was collapsing, and even the most loyal Nazi supporters could see that defeat was inevitable. Yet Hitler continued to speak of miracle weapons and final victories, of destroying his enemies through sheer will and determination. Guderian made one final attempt to inject realism into German strategy. In March 1945, he proposed a counter-offensive against Soviet forces that had established a bridgehead in eastern Germany near the town of Küstrin. The operation was poorly planned, inadequately resourced, and predictably unsuccessful. Hitler, looking for scapegoats, blamed Guderian for the failure. On March 28, 1945, Guderian was sent on medical leave, a euphemism for dismissal. His active military career was over. 6 weeks later, the war in Europe would end with Germany's unconditional surrender. When the war ended in May 1945, Guderian was taken into custody by American forces. He faced the possibility of being tried as a war criminal at Nuremberg, where the major Nazi leaders were being prosecuted. Many of his fellow officers were charged with war crimes, including illegal orders, execution of prisoners, and participation in or knowledge of atrocities. Guderian's position as a senior commander made him potentially culpable for various crimes committed by forces under his authority. However, Guderian's case presented complications for the prosecution. Unlike some German generals who had clearly participated in war crimes or issued illegal orders, the evidence against Guderian was less clear-cut. His role had been primarily operational rather than involved in occupation policy. His focus had been on armored warfare doctrine and tank tactics rather than the genocidal policies of the Nazi regime. The Americans, who were beginning to think about the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union, saw potential value in officers like Guderian, whose expertise might be useful in future conflicts. After 3 years of detention, during which he was extensively interrogated and required to write detailed accounts of various military operations, Guderian was released in 1948 without being charged with war crimes. This decision remains controversial. Critics argue that Guderian, as a senior commander, bore responsibility for crimes committed by forces under his authority, regardless of whether he personally ordered them. Supporters counter that Guderian was never shown to have direct knowledge of or participation in atrocities, and that prosecuting officers simply for serving in the German military would have meant trying tens of thousands of people. Guderian's post-war life was very different from his wartime prominence. He retired to his family's estate and focused on writing about his military experiences. In 1950, he published Panzer Leader, a memoir of his wartime service that became one of the most influential books about World War II. The book presented Guderian's perspective on key campaigns, his frustrations with Hitler's interference, and his views on why Germany lost the war. It was part memoir, part military analysis, and part self-justification. Panzer Leader became required reading for military officers around the world, particularly in Western armies developing their own armoured warfare doctrines. Guderian's descriptions of the French campaign and the early stages of Operation Barbarossa provided valuable insights into mobile warfare. His analysis of what went wrong on the Eastern Front offered lessons about the limits of offensive operations and the dangers of overextension. Military academies in the United States, Britain, France, and other NATO countries studied Guderian's work as they prepared for potential conflict with the Soviet Union. However, Panzer Leader was not simply an objective historical account. Like many memoirs written by German generals after the war, it presented a carefully constructed narrative that minimized the author's connection to Nazi crimes and deflected blame for Germany's defeat onto Hitler and other Nazi leaders. Guderian portrayed himself as a pure military professional, concerned only with operational effectiveness and frustrated by political interference. He downplayed his own role in aggressive wars of conquest and ignored the fact that his tactical successes enabled Nazi occupation and genocide. This pattern of selective memory was common among German generals who wrote memoirs after the war. They created what historians call the clean Wehrmacht myth, the idea that the German military fought honorably and professionally while the real crimes were committed by the SS and other Nazi party organizations. This myth served multiple purposes. It allowed former German officers to rehabilitate their reputations. It provided Western militaries with German expertise for the Cold War without the moral complications of acknowledging their Nazi connections. And it simplified the complex reality of how deeply the Wehrmacht was implicated in Nazi crimes. Guderian's case exemplifies these complications. His primary focus was genuinely on military operations rather than political ideology. He was not involved in planning or implementing the Holocaust. His tactical innovations were brilliant military achievements by any objective standard. Yet these innovations served a genocidal regime. The speed of his advances in Poland and France enabled Nazi occupation and the implementation of racial policies. His operations on the Eastern Front created the conditions under which millions of Soviet citizens were murdered, starved, or worked to death. The question of how to evaluate Guderian's legacy mirrors the broader question of how to evaluate German military excellence during World War II. Should we separate tactical skill from strategic goals? Can we study military innovation while condemning the purposes it served? Or does service to Nazi Germany forever taint any achievement, regardless of its purely military merits? These questions have no easy answers, and different historians reach different conclusions based on how they balance professional competence against moral responsibility. What is undeniable is Guderian's profound influence on modern military doctrine. The concept of mobile armoured warfare that he developed and demonstrated became the foundation for how modern armies think about conventional combat. The American armoured divisions that defeated Iraq in 1991 in a lightning campaign of less than 100 hours were applying Guderian-esque principles of speed, shock, and deep penetration. Israeli armored tactics that won the Six-Day War in 1967 showed clear influence of blitzkrieg doctrine. Soviet deep battle theory, while developed independently, shared many characteristics with Guderian's concepts. Military professionals continue to study Guderian's campaigns because they offer insights that remain relevant. How do you coordinate different military branches, tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power to achieve maximum effect? How do you maintain momentum in offensive operations? When do you bypass resistance? And when do you stop to eliminate threats to your flanks and supply lines? How do you balance speed against security? These operational questions transcend the specific political context in which Guderian worked, which is why military officers study his campaigns despite the uncomfortable association with Nazi Germany. Guderian lived quietly in West Germany through the 1950s and 1960s, occasionally consulted by military historians and defense planners, but largely removed from public life. He advised the new West German military, the Bundeswehr, on the organization of armored forces, though his influence was limited by his age and by the very different strategic situation West Germany faced as a NATO member, rather than an aggressive, expansionist power. He died on May 14, 1954, at the age of 65, having outlived the regime he served and witnessed the partition of Germany into East and West. A consequence of the war, his tactics had helped Germany fight. The contrast between Guderian's survival and the fates of Model, Klug, and Rommel is striking. Those three generals all died by their own hands, unable or unwilling to face the consequences of Germany's defeat. Guderian survived, stood trial in the court of international opinion, if not in actual war crimes proceedings, and lived to shape how history remembered him through his writings. His survival allowed him to present his own narrative, to emphasize his military professionalism while downplaying his service to Nazi goals. Whether this opportunity made his legacy clearer or more complicated remains a matter of debate. Guderian's story also highlights how post-war geopolitics affected judgments about World War II. Had the Cold War not begun so quickly after World War II ended, Western nations might have been less interested in German military expertise and more inclined to prosecute German officers for their roles in aggressive war. But the emerging confrontation with the Soviet Union made German knowledge valuable, and officers like Guderian, who could claim to have been apolitical professionals, became assets rather than liabilities. The Cold War narrative that separated good German military professionals from bad Nazi ideologues served Western interests, even if it oversimplified historical reality. The broader lesson from Guderian's career concerns the relationship between innovation and ethics. Guderian genuinely revolutionized warfare, developing concepts that changed how armies fight. This intellectual achievement was real and significant, yet it was placed in service of conquest and genocide. Can we celebrate the innovation while condemning its application? Military professionals have to grapple with this question as they study Guderian's tactics while teaching their students about the moral catastrophe those tactics enabled. There is no simple resolution to this tension, which is precisely what makes Guderian's legacy so challenging and so important to understand. As we turn to our final general, we encounter yet another dimension of these complex legacies. If Guderian revolutionized how armies move and fight, our next commander demonstrated brilliance in how armies are organized and led at the highest strategic levels. His achievements were even more spectacular than Guderian's in some ways, his influence on German military thought even more profound. Yet his story, like those of all the generals we have examined, must be understood within the context of the regime he served and the catastrophic war that regime unleashed. His survival, like Guderian's, allowed him to shape his own historical narrative, though even more controversially and with even more lasting influence on how military history is written and taught. Our first general on this list, the one we rank as the greatest of the five, presents perhaps the most complex and controversial legacy of all. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was born Fritz Erich Georg Eduard von Lewinsky on November 24, 1887, in Berlin. His birth name reflects the complicated circumstances of his upbringing. Shortly after his birth, he was adopted by his childless aunt and her husband, General Georg von Manstein, and took the Manstein name. This adoption connected him to one of Prussia's most distinguished military families, providing entry into the aristocratic officer class that dominated the German military. Von Manstein's path to military prominence followed the traditional trajectory of Prussian military aristocracy. He joined the Imperial German Army as a cadet in 1906 and was commissioned as a lieutenant in 1907. He served with distinction during World War I, earning recognition for his abilities as a staff officer. Unlike Rommel, who made his name through personal bravery in combat, or Guderian, who developed revolutionary tactical concepts, von Manstein's genius was primarily strategic and operational. He excelled at planning large-scale military campaigns, coordinating multiple armies, and solving the complex logistical and organizational challenges of modern warfare. Between the two world wars, von Manstein continued to rise through the ranks of the German military. He held various staff positions where his analytical abilities and strategic thinking marked him as one of the Army's most promising officers. By the time World War II began in September 1939, he was serving as Chief of Staff to General Gerd von Rundstedt during the invasion of Poland. It was a significant position, but not yet one that would make him famous. That would come through his role in planning Germany's greatest military victory. After the conquest of Poland, German military planners turned their attention to France. The initial plan, developed by the German High Command, called for a major thrust through Belgium, similar to the approach used in 1914 during World War I. Von Manstein studied this plan and recognized its fundamental flaws. The Allies expected an attack through Belgium and had positioned their best forces to meet it. A direct assault would likely result in a bloody stalemate similar to World War I, exactly the kind of attritional warfare Germany could not afford. Von Manstein proposed a radically different approach. Rather than making the main thrust through Belgium, he suggested concentrating German armour for a massive attack through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French considered unsuitable for large-scale tank operations. This force would strike at Sedan, break through French defences, and race to the English Channel, cutting Allied armies in half. The plan was audacious, even reckless in the eyes of conservative German commanders. If the attack through the Ardennes was discovered and stopped, the entire offensive would fail catastrophically. The German High Command initially rejected von Manstein's plan. They found it too risky, too dependent on the Allies making predictable mistakes. Von Manstein's insistence on his alternative plan irritated his superiors to the point that they transferred him to command an infantry corps, effectively removing him from the planning process. However, fate intervened. Officers sympathetic to von Manstein's ideas brought it to Hitler's attention during a meeting in February 1940. Hitler, always attracted to bold strokes and dramatic gambles, immediately recognized the plan's potential. He ordered the German strategy revised to incorporate von Manstein's concepts. The result was the Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the military operation that destroyed France in 6 weeks. When the offensive began on May 10, 1940, it unfolded almost exactly as von Manstein had predicted. German armour burst through the Ardennes, broke through at Sedan, and raced to the Channel coast. French and British forces, deployed to meet the expected attack through Belgium, found themselves outflanked and cut off. By the end of May, the campaign's outcome was already clear. By late June, France had surrendered and British forces had evacuated from Dunkirk. Von Manstein's strategic vision had delivered Germany its most spectacular victory. Following the French campaign, von Manstein was promoted to general and given command of the 56th Panzer Corps for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. His forces formed part of Army Group North, tasked with capturing Leningrad. The initial weeks of the campaign saw dramatic German advances and enormous Soviet casualties. Von Manstein's corps advanced rapidly through the Baltic states, demonstrating the same kind of mobile warfare that had succeeded in France. By September 1941, German forces had surrounded Leningrad and begun the siege that would last nearly 900 days and kill hundreds of thousands of civilians. However, von Manstein's greatest achievements and most controversial decisions came after he was transferred to command the 11th Army in the southern sector of the Eastern Front. The 11th Army had the mission of conquering the Crimean Peninsula, a strategically important region jutting into the Black Sea. The campaign for Crimea showcased von Manstein's abilities as an operational commander. He methodically reduced Soviet defenses, captured the fortress city of Sevastopol after a prolonged siege, and cleared the peninsula of Soviet forces. The numbers tell the story of von Manstein's effectiveness. In a single battle during the Crimean campaign, the 11th Army captured 430,000 Soviet prisoners. This was operational success on a massive scale, demonstrating von Manstein's ability to plan and execute complex military operations against determined opposition. For his achievements in Crimea, Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal on July 1, 1942. At 54 years old, von Manstein had reached the pinnacle of German military rank. But von Manstein's time commanding the 11th Army also saw atrocities committed by German forces under his authority. The Crimean campaign was not just a military operation, but part of the Nazi racial war in the East. Wehrmacht units participated in massacres of Jews and other civilians deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. SS Einsatzgruppen, death squads, operated in territory controlled by the 11th Army, conducting systematic murder of Jewish populations. While von Manstein later claimed ignorance of these crimes, evidence suggests he was aware of at least some of the atrocities and did nothing to stop them. This dark reality would haunt his legacy and eventually result in war. Crimes prosecution. After the fall of Sevastopol, von Manstein was transferred north to command German forces attempting to relieve the 6th Army, which had become trapped in Stalingrad. The Stalingrad relief operation was one of the most challenging military problems any German commander faced during the war. The 6th Army, under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, was surrounded by Soviet forces in the ruins of Stalingrad. The relief force had to fight through hundreds of kilometers of Soviet-held territory in winter conditions to reach them. Von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm in December 1942, and his forces came remarkably close to success. At one point, von Manstein's relief columns were just 48 kilometers from Stalingrad's perimeter. He urged Paulus to break out and meet the relieving forces, but Paulus refused, bound by Hitler's order to hold Stalingrad at all costs. Without Paulus's cooperation, von Manstein could not complete the relief operation. Soviet counterattacks threatened to encircle the relief force itself, forcing von Manstein to order a retreat. The 6th Army remained trapped in Stalingrad and surrendered in February 1943, with 90,000 survivors going into Soviet captivity. Few would ever return. Despite the failure to relieve Stalingrad, von Manstein's reputation continued to grow. In February 1943, he commanded the German counteroffensive that recaptured the city of Kharkov, one of Germany's most impressive tactical victories of the entire war. Soviet forces had advanced rapidly following the Stalingrad victory, overextending their supply lines and creating opportunities for German counterattacks. Von Manstein recognized these opportunities and struck with precision and speed. The recapture of Kharkov stabilized the southern portion of the Eastern Front and demonstrated that Germany could still achieve tactical victories even as its strategic position deteriorated. Von Manstein's command of Army Group South during 1943 and early 1944 showcased his defensive genius. He fought a series of brilliant delaying actions, trading space for time, preserving German forces while inflicting heavy casualties on the advancing Soviets. He advocated for a strategy of mobile defense, pulling back to avoid encirclement and then counterattacking when opportunities arose. This approach conflicted with Hitler's insistence on holding every meter of ground, regardless of strategic value. The tension between von Manstein's operational judgment and Hitler's political demands created constant friction. The relationship between von Manstein and Hitler exemplified the broader dysfunction in German strategic decision-making during World War II. Von Manstein was arguably Germany's most talented operational commander, with a proven record of success in planning and executing complex military campaigns. Hitler, whatever his political abilities, lacked formal military training and relied on intuition and political considerations rather than professional military analysis. Yet Hitler insisted on controlling tactical details and overruling his generals' recommendations. Von Manstein found himself constantly fighting two battles, one against the Soviets and one against his own Supreme Commander's interference. By early 1944, von Manstein had concluded that Germany could not win the war militarily. He believed Germany's only hope was to seek a negotiated peace with either the Western Allies or the Soviet Union, ending the two-front war that was draining Germany's resources. He tried several times to convince Hitler to pursue diplomatic solutions, but the Führer refused to consider anything short of complete victory. Hitler's inflexible commitment to total war, even when total victory was impossible, meant that Germany would fight until completely destroyed. In March 1944, after another strategic disagreement about how to conduct defensive operations in Ukraine, Hitler dismissed von Manstein from command. The official reason was that von Manstein needed younger generals for the challenges ahead, but the real reason was their irreconcilable differences over strategy. Von Manstein retired to his estate and played no further role in the war. He was not involved in the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler, though he had connections to some of the conspirators. His dismissal probably saved his life, as he was far enough removed from events that he avoided the post-assassination purge that killed many German officers. When the war ended, von Manstein was arrested by British forces and held for possible war crimes prosecution. Initially, it seemed he might escape prosecution, as the main Nuremberg trials focused on the most senior Nazi leaders, rather than military commanders. However, the British decided to hold separate trials for senior Wehrmacht officers, and von Manstein was selected as one of the defendants. The trial, held in Hamburg in 1949, focused on war, crimes allegedly committed by forces under his command, particularly during the Crimean campaign. The prosecution presented evidence that von Manstein had been aware of mass executions of Jews and other civilians in areas controlled by his armies. They showed that Wehrmacht units under his command had cooperated with SS death squads. They documented orders von Manstein had issued that facilitated the Holocaust by requiring military cooperation with SS operations. Von Manstein's defense argued that he was a professional soldier, focused on military operations, that SS atrocities were outside his responsibility, and that he had taken action to limit collaboration between Wehrmacht and SS when possible. The trial lasted months and generated enormous controversy. Many British military officers testified as character witnesses for von Manstein, praising his abilities and arguing that he was a soldier rather than a Nazi ideologue. Winston Churchill contributed money to von Manstein's defense fund, believing that the trial was unfair and that von Manstein represented the kind of professional German military expertise that might be valuable in the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union. This support from prominent British figures outraged many who believed that senior German commanders bore responsibility for Nazi crimes, regardless of whether they personally committed atrocities. Von Manstein was ultimately convicted of war crimes, but only on some charges. He was acquitted of the most serious accusations, but found guilty of failing to protect civilian populations and of implementing policies that enabled SS crimes. He was sentenced to 18 years imprisonment, a sentence that many felt was too lenient given the crimes involved. In prison, von Manstein's health deteriorated and he suffered a series of medical problems. Pressure mounted for his early release, with supporters arguing that continued imprisonment served no purpose and that Germany needed experienced military leaders as it rebuilt its defense forces. In 1953, after serving only 4 years of his sentence, von Manstein was released on medical grounds. The early release was controversial, with critics arguing that he had been let off far too lightly for his role in enabling atrocities. Supporters countered that he had been convicted primarily for command responsibility rather than direct participation in crimes, and that his continued imprisonment served no useful purpose. The decision reflected the changing geopolitical climate of the early 1950s, when Cold War concerns were beginning to outweigh concerns about prosecuting former German officers. Following his release, von Manstein became an advisor to the newly formed West German military, the Bundeswehr. His expertise was valued by NATO strategists planning defense against potential Soviet aggression. He advised on the organization of armored forces, defensive strategy, and officer training. This role was deeply ironic. The man who had helped Hitler conquer much of Europe was now helping design defenses against communist expansion. The Cold War created strange alignments, turning former enemies into partners and focusing attention on new threats rather than old crimes. Von Manstein also devoted considerable energy to writing his memoirs, published in 1955 as Lost Victories. The book became one of the most influential military memoirs of World War II, widely read by military professionals and historians. Like Guderian's Panzer leader, von Manstein's memoir presented a carefully constructed narrative that emphasized military professionalism while downplaying political complicity. Von Manstein portrayed himself as a pure strategist, concerned only with operational effectiveness and frustrated by Hitler's political interference. He minimized his awareness of Nazi atrocities and presented German military operations as separate from the regime's ideological crimes. Lost victories, argued, that Germany could have won the war, or at least achieved a favorable stalemate, if Hitler had followed von Manstein's strategic advice. The book blamed Germany's defeat on Hitler's refusal to conduct mobile defensive operations, his insistence on holding every piece of territory regardless of strategic value, and his interference in tactical decisions. This narrative was enormously influential in shaping post-war understanding of the German military. It reinforced the idea that German generals were brilliant professionals undermined by Nazi political leadership, rather than complicit participants in aggressive war and genocide. However, more recent historical scholarship has challenged many of von Manstein's claims. Historians have documented his awareness of and cooperation with Nazi racial policies. They have shown that Wehrmacht operations were deeply integrated with SS atrocities, not separate from them as von Manstein claimed. They have demonstrated that senior German officers, including von Manstein, bore substantial responsibility for implementing Hitler's criminal policies in occupied territories. The clean Wehrmacht myth that von Manstein helped create has been thoroughly discredited by archival research, though the myth still influences popular understanding. Von Manstein's influence on military thought extended far beyond his own memoirs. Throughout the Cold War, NATO officers studied his campaigns as examples of operational excellence. His defense of Army Group South in 1943-1944, conducting mobile defensive operations against numerically superior Soviet forces, became a model for how Western forces might defend against Soviet attack. His emphasis on operational flexibility, on trading space for time, on counterattacking to disrupt enemy plans, all of these concepts influence NATO doctrine. The irony of studying Nazi Germany's most successful commander to plan defense against Soviet communism was not lost on observers, but Cold War pragmatism outweighed historical sensibilities. The question of how to evaluate von Manstein's legacy parallels debates about all the generals we have examined. Was he a brilliant strategist whose talents were misused by a criminal regime? Or was he a willing participant in aggressive war whose operational success enabled genocide? Different historians emphasize different aspects of his record. Military professionals tend to focus on his operational achievements while acknowledging the problematic political context. Historians of the Holocaust emphasize his complicity in atrocities and his post-war efforts to obscure that complicity. Both perspectives capture important truths. Von Manstein lived quietly in Bavaria through the 1960s and early 1970s, occasionally consulting on military matters but largely removed from public life. He died on June 9, 1973, at the age of 85, having outlived all the other generals on our list, and having witnessed the complete transformation of Germany from Nazi dictatorship to democratic member of NATO. His funeral was attended by senior West German military officers and NATO representatives, a testament to his continued influence on Western military thought, despite his war crimes conviction. The ranking of von Manstein as the greatest of these 5 generals is based primarily on his strategic and operational achievements. He planned the campaign that defeated France, one of the most successful military operations in history. He demonstrated consistent excellence in command across multiple theatres and against different opponents. His defensive operations in 1943 to 1944 showed mastery of mobile warfare under the most challenging conditions. His influence on military doctrine extended decades beyond the war itself. From a purely military perspective, his achievements were extraordinary. However, this ranking also highlights the fundamental problem in creating such lists. How do we weigh military excellence against moral failure? Von Manstein's strategic brilliance enabled some of Nazi Germany's greatest crimes. His operations in Crimea were accompanied by systematic mass murder. His defensive genius prolonged a war that was already morally indefensible. Does operational success that serves genocidal purposes deserve to be celebrated even in a purely military context? Or does the nature of the cause forever taint the achievement? These are not comfortable questions, and there are no easy answers. But they are essential questions that we must grapple with when studying World War II and its commanders. Military history cannot be separated from moral history. The brilliant campaigns we study were fought in service of conquest and genocide. The tactical innovations we analyze were developed to achieve objectives that included the mass murder of entire populations. Understanding this context does not necessarily mean refusing to study these commanders, but it does mean studying them with full awareness of what their success meant in human terms. The 5 generals we have examined represent different facets of German military leadership during World War II. Walter Model, the loyal Nazi who fought desperately to postpone the inevitable defeat. Günther von Kluge, the traditional Prussian officer trapped between duty and morality. Erwin Rommel, the tactical genius whose fame transcended national boundaries, but whose brilliance served evil purposes. Heinz Guderian, the military theorist who revolutionized warfare, but whose innovations enabled conquest and genocide. And Erich von Manstein, the strategic mastermind whose operational excellence was inseparable from the atrocities committed by forces under his command. What unites these men beyond their undeniable military talents is the moral compromise inherent in their service to Nazi Germany. Some embraced Nazi ideology, others kept their distance from it, but all placed their considerable skills at the disposal of a regime that committed unprecedented crimes. Their military achievements cannot be separated from the political project those achievements advanced. They were not simply soldiers doing their duty, but participants in aggressive wars and, directly or indirectly, enablers of genocide. Yet to simply condemn these men and refuse to study their campaigns would be to lose important historical and military lessons. Their innovations in mobile warfare, their mastery of defensive operations, their solutions to complex logistical and organizational problems, all of these remain relevant to understanding modern military operations. The key is to study these commanders with clear moral awareness, recognizing both their professional excellence and their service to evil. This balanced approach allows us to learn from their campaigns while never forgetting the human cost of their success. The legacy of these generals also reminds us about the dangers of separating professional competence from ethical responsibility. All 5 men were highly skilled at their profession, but their profession was violence, and violence in service of unjust causes is criminal regardless of how skillfully it is conducted. The Nuremberg trials established the principle that individuals bear responsibility for their actions even when following orders, even when serving their nation's government. This principle applies to generals as much as to common soldiers, perhaps more so given their greater authority and awareness of strategic goals. What would these generals think if they could see how their legacies are debated today? Would they accept responsibility for the crimes enabled by their military success? Or would they insist, as they did after the war, that they were simply soldiers doing their duty? We cannot know for certain, though their post-war memoirs suggest they would maintain their claims of professional innocence. But history judges them not by their self-perception but by the full context of their actions and their consequences. In the end, studying these 5 generals teaches us as much about the relationship between military excellence and political goals as it does about specific tactics and strategies. It reminds us that professional skill can serve any master, that brilliance and brutality are not mutually exclusive, and that the greatest victories can enable the greatest crimes. These are uncomfortable truths, but they are truths that anyone studying military history must confront. The alternative is a sanitized version of history that teaches tactical lessons while ignoring moral ones, and that would be the greatest disservice we could do to the millions who died in the war these generals helped wage. The 5 greatest German generals of World War II were undeniably talented military commanders whose campaigns are still studied by military professionals around the world. But they were also servants of a genocidal regime whose defeat was necessary for human civilization to survive. Both facts are true, both must be acknowledged, and both must inform how we remember them and learn from their example. Their military genius is part of the historical record, but so is the moral catastrophe they served. Only by holding both truths in mind can we properly understand their place in history and extract whatever lessons their careers might offer without celebrating achievements that came at such a terrible human cost. These 5 men represented different generations and different philosophical approaches to military command, yet all found themselves serving the same doomed cause. Model, born in 1891, was young enough to be shaped by World War I, but old enough to have developed his military philosophy in the Imperial German Army. Klug, born in 1882, was deeply rooted in the old Prussian military tradition, with all its emphasis on honor, duty, and aristocratic leadership. Rommel, also born in 1891, bridged the gap between traditional infantry tactics and modern mobile warfare. Guderian, born in 1888, was the theorist who reimagined what armies could do with machines and speed. And Manstein, born in 1887, was the strategic thinker who could envision entire campaigns from conception through execution. Their different backgrounds led to different relationships with the Nazi regime. Model joined the party early and remained ideologically committed. Klug maintained a professional distance but never actively resisted. Rommel benefited from Nazi patronage but eventually questioned Hitler's leadership. Guderian focused on his technical specialty while avoiding political entanglements. Manstein presented himself as apolitical but implemented policies that enabled Nazi crimes. None of them were heroes of resistance, yet their degrees of complicity varied. This spectrum of involvement reminds us that there were choices available, even within the constraints of military discipline and Nazi totalitarianism. What might have happened if these talented commanders had served a different cause? The question is impossible to answer, but worth considering. Their skills were real and would have been valuable to any military. In different political circumstances, they might have defended democracy rather than undermining it, protected civilians rather than enabling their murder, and left legacies we could celebrate without moral reservation. But history does not offer such comfortable alternate timelines. We must evaluate these men based on what they actually did, not what they might have done in different circumstances. The study of these generals also raises questions about military education and professional ethics. Military academies around the world teach the campaigns of Model, Rommel, Guderian, and Manstein because they offer genuine tactical and operational lessons. Students learn about combined arms coordination from studying Guderian's campaigns, about defensive tactics from Model's delaying actions, about the limits of logistics from Rommel's desert operations, and about operational planning from Manstein's strategic designs. But how much emphasis do these courses place on the political context of these campaigns? Do students learn that Guderian's brilliant tank tactics enabled Nazi occupation? That Model's defensive genius prolonged the Holocaust? That Manstein's operational excellence was inseparable from mass murder in occupied territories? There is no perfect solution to this educational challenge. Refusing to study these campaigns because of their political context would impoverish military education, as these operations genuinely exemplify important military principles. But studying them without adequate attention to their moral dimensions teaches the wrong lessons, suggesting that professional excellence is all that matters regardless of the cause being served. The balance lies in studying these campaigns critically, extracting operational lessons while never losing sight of the larger context in which these operations occurred. The fates of these 5 generals also tell us something about how nations deal with their military past. 3 chose suicide rather than face the consequences of defeat. Model, Klug, and Rommel all took their own lives in 1944-1945. Their suicides were acts of desperation, recognition that their world had ended and that no acceptable future awaited them. The 2 who survived, Guderian and Manstein, were tried and interrogated, but ultimately incorporated into West Germany's rearmament and NATO planning. Their survival and rehabilitation reflected Cold War necessities, the need for German military expertise to counter Soviet power. This differential treatment of German generals after World War II contrasts sharply with the fate of Japanese military leaders, many of whom were executed for war crimes. The difference reflects various factors: the location of trials, the evidence available, the geopolitical situation, and different standards applied to different theatres of war. It also reflects the persistent myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the idea that German military professionals were somehow separate from Nazi ideological crimes. This myth, promoted by surviving German generals in their memoirs and accepted by Western powers for Cold War reasons, has been thoroughly discredited by modern scholarship but continues to influence popular understanding. The public memory of these generals varies significantly by country and has changed over time. In Germany, all 5 are studied as military figures, but with increasing emphasis on their complicity in Nazi crimes. In Russia, they are remembered primarily as invaders, whose forces inflicted massive casualties and destruction on Soviet territory. In the West, they are often presented through the lens of their military achievements, with the moral complexities given less emphasis. These different memories reflect different national experiences of World War II and different lessons drawn from that experience. One striking aspect of studying these generals is how their reputations have been shaped by their own writings and those of admirers. Guderian's Panzer Leader and Manstein's Lost Victories were enormously influential in shaping post-war understanding of the German military. Both books presented carefully constructed narratives that minimize the author's Nazi connections and emphasize their professional expertise. These memoirs were initially accepted largely uncritically, especially by Western military audiences interested in learning from German operational expertise. Only decades later did historians begin systematically challenging the claims in these memoirs with archival evidence. The romanticization of figures like Rommel, the Desert Fox, shows how military prowess can overshadow moral considerations in popular memory. Rommel became an almost legendary figure in the West, respected by former enemies and presented as a chivalrous warrior who fought cleanly and eventually turned against Hitler. This image, while containing elements of truth, greatly oversimplified Rommel's career and his relationship with the Nazi regime. It reflected a desire to find good Germans who could be admired without confronting the full moral horror of Nazi Germany. Only in recent years has scholarship presented a more balanced view of Rommel that acknowledges both his talents and his service to evil. The question these generals pose for us today is ultimately about how we balance professional admiration with moral judgment. Can we study their campaigns objectively while maintaining clear ethical principles? Can we learn from their mistakes and successes without implicitly endorsing their cause? Can military history be separated from political and moral history? Or must it always acknowledge the inseparable connection between tactical means and strategic ends? These questions matter not just for understanding World War II, but for thinking about military ethics in any era. And here you have our list of what we think are 5 of the greatest German generals of World War II. We hope you enjoyed our exploration of these complex and controversial figures. Their stories remind us that military excellence must always be evaluated within its moral and political context, and that professional competence divorced from ethical responsibility can serve the darkest purposes. These were brilliant commanders who fought for a terrible cause, and their legacies will forever be shaped by that fundamental contradiction. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video, What Did German Generals Think of the Allied Generals?, where we explore how these and other German commanders evaluated their opponents across the English Channel and the Atlantic. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one.